April 1943. A secret Japanese message landed in American hands, revealing every detail of Admiral Yamamoto's schedule. The very man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor. The Japanese laughed, believing their codes unbreakable. But just 4 days later, P-38 Lightnings rose silently from Guadalcanal, flying 1,000 miles over open sea on a mission no one thought possible, to strike down the most powerful symbol of Japan's navy. April 14th, 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Inside a cramped room lined with radios, typewriters, and the constant hum of decoding machines, a young cryptographer paused, pencil in hand. The paper in front of him contained the lifeblood of the enemy, Japanese naval signals, intercepted from across the Pacific. As he translated the coded characters into English, his heart began to pound. The message was precise, too precise. It detailed times, dates, flight paths, even the exact aircraft to be used. The sender was none other than Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had humiliated America a year and a half earlier. And now, according to this intercepted schedule, he would soon be within reach of American fighters. The young sergeant slid the paper to his superior, Commander William Goggins, overseeing the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, known as FRUPAX, read the words twice. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply understood. This was not an ordinary intercept. This was history knocking. Within minutes, the message reached Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's chief intelligence officer. Layton, who had studied in Japan before the war, knew Yamamoto personally. He knew his habits, his brilliance, and his iron will. And now he knew something else, that Yamamoto's confidence in Japanese codes had doomed him. Layton stared at the paper. The date was April 18th. Departure from Rabaul at 6 a.m., arrival at Balal Airfield, 8 a.m., 2 Mitsubishi Betty bombers, an escort of 6 Zero fighters. That was it. No more, no less. For exactly 1 fleeting hour, Admiral Yamamoto, the most important Japanese commander, would be vulnerable. For the Americans, it was more than a military opportunity. It was a chance to strike at the very symbol of Japan's naval supremacy. In a war of attrition, where battles often seemed endless and faceless, this was personal. Yamamoto wasn't just another officer, he was the man who had led the attack that killed over 2,000 Americans at Pearl Harbor. But seizing this chance meant enormous risk. To reach him, American pilots would have to fly nearly 1,000 miles from Guadalcanal, across open ocean, at the very limits of their aircraft's range. One wrong turn, one unexpected headwind, and they would run out of fuel and crash into the sea. Even if they found him, they would face deadly Japanese escorts. And worst of all, if the Japanese discovered that their codes were compromised, the Allies' greatest intelligence advantage would vanish overnight. As Layton weighed the risks, he thought of the bigger picture. Kill the man, he whispered to himself, and you wound the entire fleet. And so, what began as a routine day for American codebreakers became the spark that lit one of the boldest aerial missions of the entire war. The plan had no official name at the time. Later, history would call it Operation Vengeance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was no ordinary enemy. To understand why his death would matter so deeply, we must first understand the man himself. Born in 1884, the son of a poor samurai family, Yamamoto carried both the scars and the spirit of Japan's turbulent rise as a modern power. At the age of 21, during the Russo-Japanese War, he served aboard the cruiser Nishin. A shell exploded near his position, mangling his left hand. He lost 2 fingers, but gained something more permanent, an aura of sacrifice that would follow him for life. But Yamamoto was not like many of his fellow Japanese officers. He had seen America with his own eyes. After World War I, he studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He traveled the country on trains, hitchhiked across the Midwest, and marveled at Detroit's automobile factories, Texas oil refineries, and California's aircraft plants, where other Japanese officers saw only a land of jazz, gangsters, and materialism. Yamamoto saw something more dangerous: industrial power on a scale Japan could never match. It was Yamamoto who famously warned Japan's leaders, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year. But after that, I can promise nothing." His words proved prophetic. The first 6 months after Pearl Harbor were indeed a whirlwind of Japanese victories. Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore. But Yamamoto knew it could not last. Still, despite his doubts, Yamamoto obeyed orders. When war was decided, he planned the Pearl Harbor attack with mathematical precision. On December 7, 1941, his carrier struck Hawaii with devastating effect. Over 2,000 Americans were killed, the Pacific Fleet was crippled, and the nation was shocked into war. For the Japanese people, Yamamoto became a national hero. For Americans, he became the face of treachery. Yet behind his legendary status, Yamamoto remained a complex figure. He loved poetry, practiced calligraphy, and was a skilled poker player. He admired aspects of American culture and spoke fluent English. But his loyalty to the emperor and to Japan's navy bound him to a war he never wanted. By early 1943, Yamamoto's star had begun to fade. The stunning Japanese defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal had shown that his earlier prophecy was coming true. Still, he remained the most respected military mind in Japan, the one man whose death could shake the confidence of an entire nation. And that was exactly what American intelligence officers understood. This wasn't just about shooting down an airplane. This was about striking at a symbol. Yamamoto was not only a commander, he was the spirit of Japan's navy, the living proof that their empire could challenge the world's greatest industrial power. To kill him would be more than a tactical victory. It would be a psychological earthquake. As American planners looked at the decoded message in Pearl Harbor, they didn't just see a target. They saw the chance to decapitate the very heart of Japan's naval pride. The clock was ticking. In just 4 days, Yamamoto would be airborne. Following the schedule he never dreamed his enemies could raid. The hunters were preparing, and the prey was unknowingly flying toward them. Okay. The American pilot selected for Operation Vengeance faced a simple but merciless truth. No ordinary fighter in the Pacific could even reach Yamamoto. The Japanese admiral would be flying nearly 600 miles from his base at Rabaul, deep into the Solomon Islands. To catch him, American aircraft would need to fly almost 1,000 miles round trip, further than any U.S. fighter had ever dared. The Army Air Forces had only one answer: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. On the tarmac at Guadalcanal's Fighter Strip No. 2, the P-38 looked like no other plane in the world. Twin engines, twin booms, and a central cockpit pod gave it an almost futuristic silhouette. Some pilots loved it at first sight. Others thought it looked too strange, too heavy, too complicated. But in April 1943, the Lightning wasn't just an option. It was the only machine that could go the distance. Powered by two Allison V1710 engines, the P-38 could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour and climb higher than most Japanese fighters. More importantly, it could carry enormous amounts of fuel. With 300 gallons inside its main tanks and an extra 330 gallons in 2 drop tanks slung beneath the wings, the Lightning could stay airborne for nearly 6 hours. That was just enough to reach the ambush point, fight, and, hopefully, limp back home. But range alone wasn't enough. The mission demanded firepower that could shred an enemy bomber in seconds. In this, too, the Lightning was unique. Instead of scattering guns across its wings like most fighters, Lockheed engineers had concentrated all its weapons in the nose: 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20 mm cannon. This design eliminated the tricky problem of converging bullets and created a single stream of destruction. At close range, it was like pointing a flying shotgun at the target, devastatingly accurate. The pilots trusted the Lightning's bite, but they feared its appetite. Each engine burned fuel like a locomotive, and there was almost no margin for error. At cruising power, both engines consumed about 100 gallons per hour. A little too much throttle, a longer dogfight than expected, or a headwind on the return, and they would be forced to ditch in the ocean. For the men chosen for the Jace mission, the Lightning was both savior and executioner. Major John W. Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, studied every figure with the precision of an engineer. He measured distances, calculated headings, and plotted fuel consumption to the gallon. The numbers terrified him: 1,000 miles of flying, with maybe 7 minutes of combat at full power before they ran dry. The Lightning could do it, but only if the pilots flew with absolute discipline. Even the takeoff would be a test. Fully loaded with drop tanks, ammunition, and supplies, each P-38 would weigh nearly 17,000 pounds. The dirt strip at Guadalcanal barely seemed long enough. Any mechanical failure during the flight would be fatal. There would be no rescue, no search parties, only the endless Pacific waiting below. Still, the Lightning was chosen. It was fast, it was deadly, and above all, it was the only bird in the Pacific with wings long enough to reach Yamamoto. As one pilot put it later, The P-38 didn't forgive mistakes, but if you respected her, she would carry you further than any fighter on Earth. And so, in the spring heat of Guadalcanal, the Lockheed Lightnings sat ready, their polished propellers glinting in the sun. Soon they would lift into the air on one of the most dangerous missions of the war, a mission that would test both man and machine to their absolute limits. Every mission in war is flown by machines, but it is the men inside those cockpits who carry the burden. Operation Vengeance would be no different. Behind the gleaming P-38, Lightnings were young Americans, each with his own reason for taking the gamble that could make him famous, or end his life in the sea. Major John W. Mitchell was the man in command. At 31 years old, he had logged over 2,000 flying hours in everything from fragile biplanes to the most advanced fighters in the world. A son of Portland, Oregon, Mitchell was methodical to the point of obsession. He trusted math, maps, and discipline more than luck. For him, this mission was not about glory. It was about precision. His pilots called him Johnny Zero because he seemed to have no tolerance for error. Zero margin, zero excuses. If Mitchell was the brain of the operation, Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. was its ambition. Tall, broad-shouldered, and charismatic, the 27-year-old son of a decorated World War I aviator seemed destined for recognition. Lanphier had already claimed several victories, though some were disputed. What no one disputed was his hunger for the spotlight. He was the kind of pilot who carried himself like he was already writing his own memoir. "This mission," he told a fellow officer quietly the night before, "is my ticket to history." Then there was First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, who couldn't have been more different. Born in the small farming town of Culver, Oregon, Barber was the son of a blacksmith. He studied engineering in college before enlisting in 1940. He didn't smoke, drank little, and spoke less. Where Lanphier sought headlines, Barber sought efficiency. He flew like he lived, carefully, deliberately, with every move calculated. His fellow pilots joked that if you put a slide rule in his cockpit, Barber would use it mid-flight. He wasn't out for fame. He was out to do the job and come home alive. These differences mattered. In aerial combat, personalities often determined tactics. Lanphier liked aggressive head-on attacks, diving into a fight, even if the odds were poor. Barber preferred patience, positioning himself carefully before pulling the trigger. Mitchell valued order above all, expecting his men to follow the plan to the second. Together, they created a mix of ambition, precision, and quiet determination. And yet, they were all still young men. None of them had crossed 30. Some wrote letters home the night before, carefully sealing them in case they didn't return. Others smoked in silence outside the tents, listening to the jungle insects sing in the Guadalcanal night. They had been through combat, yes, but this was different. This wasn't just another patrol. This was a manhunt, sanctioned at the very highest levels, approved by President Roosevelt himself. Among them, whispers circulated about what it would mean to succeed. Some said it would shorten the war. Others said it was revenge for Pearl Harbor. For Lanphier, it was personal immortality. For Barber, it was simply duty. For Mitchell, it was proof that planning and discipline could snatch victory from impossible odds. As dawn approached, the three men tightened their parachute harnesses, adjusted their maps, and prepared for the most important flight of their lives. In just hours, they would be streaking low across the Pacific, chasing a man who represented both the brilliance and the hubris of Japan's empire. And while their motivations differed, their fate would now be tied together in one mission, one gamble, one chance to strike at the heart of the enemy. The plan to intercept Admiral Yamamoto was as much about mathematics as it was about courage. Every pilot knew it. The mission would succeed or fail on navigation alone. From Guadalcanal to the tiny island of Bougainville, where Yamamoto's aircraft would pass, the straight-line distance was 435 miles. But the Americans couldn't fly straight. That route would take them directly over Japanese-held islands, bristling with radar posts, coast watchers, and zero patrols. To avoid detection, Major Mitchell designed a sweeping dogleg route, far out to sea, then north, then back inland. It added more than 150 miles to the trip. That made the total journey nearly 1,000 miles round trip, right at the razor's edge of the P-38's endurance. Mitchell sat with his pilots the night before, spreading maps across a wooden table lit by a single lamp. The air in the tent was thick with the smell of sweat, kerosene, and damp jungle. He pointed to each leg of the flight with a pencil, his voice calm but unyielding. Leg 1. West by southwest, 55 minutes at wavetop height, skimming just 50 feet above the water. Leg 2, a sharp turn north, climbing gradually while still hugging the ocean. Leg 3 and 4, long runs across open sea, where any deviation, just 1 degree off course, could push them miles away from the intercept point. Final leg, a climb to 18,000 feet at exactly the right moment, arriving over Bougainville at 0935 hours, precisely when Yamamoto's plane was scheduled to pass. The numbers were unforgiving. Each P-38 carried 690 gallons of fuel, 300 in the main tanks, 60 in the reserves, and 330 in the 2 drop tanks. At cruising speed, the twin Allison engines burned about 100 gallons per hour. That left 5 hours and 45 minutes of flying time under ideal conditions. The mission would require at least 4.5. That gave them maybe 7 minutes, 7 precious minutes, to fight the battle, finish the job, and turn for home. No more, no less. Mitchell made it clear. There would be no searching if they missed Yamamoto. No circling, no dogfights with zeros they didn't have to fight. They had to be at the right place, at the right minute, or they would not return at all. The pilots listened in silence. They understood. They weren't just flying to kill a man. They were gambling their lives against the clock, the compass, and the fuel gauge. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightnings roared down the Guadalcanal Strip and lifted into the tropical air, their drop tanks heavy with fuel. The jungle fell away, the ocean stretched ahead, and the pilots settled into silence. At 50 feet above the water, even the roar of their engines seemed swallowed by the vast Pacific. Hour after hour, they flew. No radio chatter, no landmarks, just a compass needle and the steady hand of Major Mitchell leading the formation. Sweat soaked their flight suits as they skimmed the waves, the line between sky and sea blurring in the heat. It was flying at its most primitive and its most unforgiving. A single mistake would mean empty tanks and a watery grave. And yet, as the coastline of Bougainville crept into view ahead, the formation was still tight, the timing perfect. Against all odds, they were exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. Now it was only a matter of whether Yamamoto would appear. April 18th, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. The morning began like so many others for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The sun rose over the harbor, casting gold across the anchored warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The air smelled faintly of salt, oil, and smoke. At age 59, Yamamoto still carried himself with the sharpness of a much younger man. His uniform was immaculate, his sword polished, his schedule planned to the minute. On this day, his itinerary called for an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Northern Solomons. He believed it was important for morale. The war had turned darker after Midway and Guadalcanal. Losses had mounted. Soldiers needed to see their commander, to hear his words, to believe that Japan's cause still had purpose. Yamamoto had always placed duty above comfort, so he would go, regardless of the risk. Before leaving, he reviewed the day's plan with his staff officers. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, lightly armed but long-ranged, would carry the Admiral and his party. 6 Zero fighters would escort them. The route was familiar. The timing was exact. What Yamamoto did not know, what he could not imagine, was that every detail of this plan was already in American hands. He believed his codes were unbreakable. He believed in the loyalty of his men and the precision of his navy. To him, the possibility of betrayal by mathematics, a pencil scratching on paper in a hidden radio room thousands of miles away, was unthinkable. As he stepped out toward the waiting aircraft, Yamamoto paused for a moment. Despite the crispness of his uniform and the calmness of his face, those close to him later recalled, he seemed weary. He had carried the burden of war since 1941, often against his own instincts. He knew, perhaps better than anyone in Japan, that America's industrial might was a storm no empire could outlast. Still, he performed his duty with the quiet dignity of a samurai. His aide offered him a final cup of tea. Yamamoto took it, savoring the warmth in his hands. For years, he had practiced calligraphy in his free time, even after losing 2 fingers in battle decades earlier. That morning, he had brushed a single character onto rice paper. Katsu. Victory. At 6:00 a.m., he climbed into the bomber. The Betty was a slim, cigar-shaped aircraft, built for range rather than survival. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Its armor was almost non-existent. Japanese crews grimly called it the Type 1 lighter, because once hit, it often went up in flames. Yamamoto knew this, but he trusted his Zero escort. The engines coughed to life. Propellers blurred into motion. The bomber taxied across the strip, lifted its nose, and climbed into the tropical sky. The second bomber followed close behind. 6 Zeros circled into position above, wings flashing in the morning sun. From the ground, officers saluted. Sailors paused to watch as the formation dwindled into specks against the blue horizon. None could have guessed they were watching the final flight of Japan's greatest admiral. The air inside Yamamoto's bomber was loud and cramped. He sat upright, his sword across his knees, his aide beside him, reading out the day's schedule once more. Calm, disciplined, and punctual as ever, Yamamoto believed he was in control. But fate was already racing toward him on the wings of 18 American Lightnings, skimming the ocean hundreds of miles away. The hunters and the hunted were now on a collision course. The Pacific stretched out like a sheet of glass beneath their wings. For 2.5 hours, the 18 P-38 Lightnings had flown in absolute silence, hugging the waves so low that their propellers left faint ripples on the water. No chatter, no music from the radios, only the drone of engines and the ticking of watches. Each man sat alone in his bubble of noise and sweat, following the course Major Mitchell had drilled into their minds the night before. 50 feet above the ocean. Airspeed 200 miles per hour. Heading 265. Then, precisely on schedule, Mitchell's gloved hand came up, signaling the long northward turn. The formation banked as one, carving across the empty sea. If they were off by even a few minutes, the mission would be lost. The Japanese admiral's plane would slip past unseen, and the Americans would have nothing to show for their gamble except empty tanks and a long, hungry glide into the Pacific. The strain showed in small ways. A bead of sweat rolled down Captain Lanfear's cheek, disappearing into his oxygen mask. Lieutenant Barber's eyes never left his compass. Each second stretched, each mile felt endless. Their bodies ached from holding steady over the ocean's chop, where the horizon blurred into a shimmering mirage. At exactly 9:34 a.m., Mitchell led them into a climb. The Lightnings rose from sea level, their engines straining, climbing sharply toward the jungle-green ridges of Bougainville. The air thinned, the temperature dropped. At 18,000 feet, the formation leveled off. The target area lay ahead. Now, every man's eyes scanned the skies. They were hunters, waiting in ambush, crouched in the heavens. Then Barber saw them first, tiny specks moving against the clouds. He keyed his radio for the first time in hours. "Bogies, 11 o'clock level." The tension snapped like a wire. Mitchell's reply came back instantly, calm but firm. "Tally-ho." The specks grew into shapes. 2 long-bodied Betty bombers with their green paint glinting in the sun, engines trailing faint exhaust. Behind them, 6 Zero fighters flew protective circles. To the Americans, it looked almost too perfect, like a parade formation. To Barber, it looked like destiny. The timing was uncanny. Yamamoto's bombers were exactly where the intercepted message had said they would be, down to the very minute. The codebreakers had been right. The navigation had been flawless. Now, it was up to the Lightning pilots. Mitchell gave the hand signal, splitting his formation. 12 P-38s pulled high to intercept the Zeros, while 4 dropped into position for the bombers. The sky that had been silent for hours suddenly vibrated with power. Throttles shoved forward, engines howled, and the hunters prepared to strike. For Yamamoto, flying calmly in the lead bomber, there was no warning, no radar, no radio intercept, no sense of danger. He sat with his sword across his knees, unaware that death was diving toward him at 400 miles per hour. For the Americans, every heartbeat was now a countdown. The quiet ambush shattered in an instant. Throttles slammed forward, and the 4 American Lightnings designated as the Killer Flight peeled off toward the bombers. Sunlight flashed on their silver wings as they dove, engines screaming. First, Lieutenant Rex Barber locked his eyes on the lead Mitsubishi Betty. He knew that inside sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the very architect of Pearl Harbor. This was no ordinary interception. This was vengeance in its purest form. At 400 miles per hour, the Betty grew large in his gun sight. Barber steadied his aim, squeezed the trigger, and felt the nose of his P-38 shudder as his 4 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon opened up. A hail of tracers stitched across the sky and tore into the bomber's left engine. Black smoke erupted instantly. The Betty lurched, coughed, and dropped its wing. Flames licked along the fuselage as pieces of metal sheared away. The Japanese gunners fired back wildly, their rounds sparking harmlessly against Barber's armored glass. But the lightning kept coming, relentless, pouring fire into the doomed aircraft. Inside the bomber, Yamamoto sat calmly, strapped in with his sword across his lap. Witnesses later said his body remained upright even as the plane shuddered and dropped. Whether he had time to realize what was happening, no one could ever know. Seconds later, the Betty rolled over and plunged nose first into the jungle canopy below, exploding in a fireball that sent a black column of smoke rising over Bougainville. The man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor was gone, but the fight was far from over. Captain Thomas Lanphier, circling into position, lined up on the second bomber. He fired a long burst, his tracers tearing into its tail and wing. The Betty caught fire, trailing smoke as its pilots fought to keep it level. Somehow, it stayed airborne, staggering out of formation before smashing into the jungle miles away. Above them, chaos erupted as 12 lightnings tangled with 6 Japanese Zeros. The dogfight was fast and brutal. Zeros slashed in with tight turns, firing cannons at the heavier P-38s. But the Americans had altitude and discipline. One lightning spiraled into the sea, hit by cannon fire, but others struck back. In moments, 2 Zeros fell trailing flames. For the American pilots, it was survival through teamwork. Mitchell's voice crackled once over the radio. "Stay with your wingman. Don't chase. Cover!" Down below, the jungle burned where Yamamoto's plane had crashed. The ambush had worked with uncanny precision. The battle raged only minutes, but to those in the cockpit, it felt like hours. When Mitchell finally called for a break-off, the sky was littered with smoke trails and falling wreckage. The surviving Zeros fled back toward their bases, their mission shattered. As the Americans turned south, their formation battered but intact, one truth settled over every cockpit. They had done the impossible. They had hunted an admiral, fought off his escorts, and sent him to his grave, all exactly as planned. But with their fuel running low and hundreds of miles of open ocean still ahead, survival was far from guaranteed. The jungle of Bougainville was quiet after the battle. Smoke rose lazily from the wreckage of Yamamoto's shattered bomber. Japanese search parties, sent hours later, hacked their way through the dense undergrowth until they found the crash site. The scene was grim. The Betty had plowed nose first into the trees, tearing a scar through the canopy before coming to rest in a blackened heap. Bodies lay scattered among twisted metal and scorched earth. Most were burned beyond recognition. But one figure stood out. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still strapped into his seat, had been thrown clear of the fuselage. His uniform was torn, his body broken, but remarkably, his posture was upright. His hand still rested on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. His expression, witnesses later claimed, was calm, as if death had come suddenly, before fear had touched him. The soldiers who found him stood in silence. Some saluted, others wept. They had lost not just a commander, but a living symbol of Japan's pride. News of Yamamoto's death did not reach the Japanese public immediately. The military kept it secret for weeks, fearing the effect on morale. But among officers and enlisted men, the truth spread quickly. The impact was devastating. Yamamoto was more than a strategist. He was the face of the Imperial Navy, the man who had led them to their greatest victory at Pearl Harbor. His name was known in every village, his image printed in newspapers, his words quoted in speeches. To the Japanese, he embodied the very idea that their empire could stand against America. Now, that symbol was gone, struck down not by fate, but by enemy pilots who had known exactly when and where to find him. Whispers began to circulate among officers. Had the Americans broken their codes? How else could they have appeared at the precise minute over a remote stretch of jungle with uncanny accuracy? For many, the realization was unbearable. If their communications were no longer secure, then no leader was safe, no plan hidden, no movement secret. It was as if a veil had been ripped away, exposing the empire's most guarded confidence to the light. In the weeks that followed, Yamamoto was given a state funeral. His ashes were placed in a grand urn, paraded through Tokyo with full military honors. Millions bowed their heads in reverence. But behind the ceremony lay a grim truth. Japan had lost not only an admiral, but the very man who had warned them against fighting this war in the first place. One officer, writing in his private diary, put it simply, "When Yamamoto fell, something inside us fell with him." The death of a single man had become a national wound, and the Empire, though it did not yet realize it, had already begun its slow descent toward defeat. The battle was over, but survival was far from certain. As the lightnings broke away from Bougainville, the adrenaline of the dogfight gave way to a more practical fear: fuel. The P-38s had pushed their engines hard in combat, burning precious gallons. The gauges now showed perilously low levels, and hundreds of miles of empty Pacific lay between them and safety. Major Mitchell's voice crackled on the radio. "No celebrating yet, boys. Eyes on your fuel. We're not home." The formation tightened. The Americans settled into silence again, flying wingtip to wingtip as they descended back to sea level, hoping the thinner air and steady throttle would stretch every drop of gasoline. Each man did his own grim calculations. Mitchell traced his pencil over the map taped to his kneeboard. Barber checked and rechecked his gauge, willing the needle to hold just a little longer. Lanphier clenched his teeth, replaying the dogfight in his head, already imagining how history would remember it. Hours crawled by. The Pacific below looked endless, featureless. Some pilots quietly wondered if they would have enough fuel to clear Guadalcanal's ridges. One miscalculation, and they would be forced to ditch, hoping for rescue in shark-infested waters. At last, the dark green line of Guadalcanal rose on the horizon. The lightnings limped in one by one, some sputtering on their last fumes. When Barber's wheels hit the dirt strip, his tank was nearly dry. He rolled to a stop, pulled off his helmet, and let out a long breath. Against every odd, they had made it. The pilots were met not by cheering crowds, but by quiet efficiency. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking damage, refueling, patching bullet holes. Mitchell ordered silence. No one was to discuss the mission outside their circle. The operation had been approved at the highest level, but secrecy was critical. If Japan realized their codes were broken, America's greatest advantage in the Pacific would vanish overnight. That evening, in the mess tent, the men sat over tin plates of beans and coffee. They spoke in low voices, some grinned nervously, unable to believe they were still alive. Others stared off in silence, the images of burning planes still flickering in their minds. Rex Barber, always the quiet one, ate slowly, then folded his hands. "We did the job," he said simply. "That's all that matters." For Lanphier, the story was different. He paced, already rehearsing how he would describe the kill. He believed he had fired the fatal burst at Yamamoto's bomber, and he wanted credit. A controversy would brew that lasted decades. But for the moment, Mitchell put a stop to it. "History will sort that out," he told them. "Right now, our job is to keep our mouths shut." And so, the men of Operation Vengeance returned to their tents as anonymous as they had been the night before. No headlines, no parades, not yet. Their mission had been a gamble with no margin for error, and against all odds, it had paid off. In the jungles of Bougainville, the wreckage of a Betty bomber smoldered quietly, its passenger gone forever. In Washington, intelligence officers nodded in grim satisfaction. And across the Pacific, American codebreakers continued their work, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but holding the keys to victory. The gamble had worked, and with it, America had struck a blow not just at an admiral, but at the very heart of Japan's confidence. When word reached Tokyo that Admiral Yamamoto's plane had not returned, the first reaction was disbelief. Communications officers at Rabaul sent increasingly desperate messages: overdue, missing, no contact. To lose a patrol plane was one thing. To lose the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Navy was unthinkable. For hours, the High Command clung to hope. Perhaps the Betty had diverted. Perhaps mechanical trouble had forced a landing. But when the recovery team from Bougainville radioed back the truth, silence gripped the Imperial General Headquarters. The wreckage had been found. The Admiral was dead. The reaction among officers was not just grief. It was confusion. Yamamoto's flight plan had been secret. His schedule had been guarded with the highest security. And yet the Americans had struck with uncanny precision, arriving at the exact time and place to intercept him. Whispers spread quickly. Had the codes been broken? The thought chilled the entire officer corps. Japanese strategy relied on secure radio communications to coordinate an empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. If their ciphers were compromised, every fleet movement, every convoy, every operation could be known to the enemy. It was a nightmare too great to face directly. So, at least officially, they refused to face it. Reports of enemy luck circulated, excuses that the Americans had stumbled upon the Admiral by chance. Others claimed coast watchers or spies had betrayed his route, but deep down, the suspicion gnawed. The Americans had known. Among the rank and file, Yamamoto's death hit like a thunderclap. He was not just a commander, he was a symbol of the Navy's spirit. Sailors remembered his visit to their ships, his calm speeches, his sharp eyes. Soldiers admired him as the hero of Pearl Harbor, the man who had humbled the United States. Now, the invincible admiral had been shot from the sky like any other man. Letters home captured the despair. One young officer wrote, "If the Americans can strike down Yamamoto, then who among us is safe? How can we hope to win against such enemies?" The Japanese government kept the news from the public for nearly a month, fearful of the blow to morale. But rumors spread faster than censorship. When the announcement finally came, accompanied by solemn ceremonies and photographs of Yamamoto's urn draped in black, millions of Japanese bowed their heads in mourning. The loss was more than personal. It was psychological. Yamamoto had been the embodiment of confidence, the strategist who understood both Japan's strength and its limits. With him gone, there was no one left who could balance hope with reality. The empire staggered forward, still fighting, still believing in victory. But now, with a shadow in every mind. If America could kill Yamamoto, what else could it do? History often remembers battles by their size, armies clashing, fleets colliding, thousands of men fighting for miles of territory. But sometimes, history shifts on a single flight, a single ambush, a single decision made in silence. Operation Vengeance was one of those moments. To the men who flew it, the mission was not about politics or symbolism. It was about doing their duty, flying their route, pulling the trigger when the target appeared. Rex Barber would later describe it simply, "We were just told to get him, and we did." But to the world, the impact was far greater. For Japan, Yamamoto's death was a wound that never fully healed. It robbed the Imperial Navy of its most experienced strategist, the one man who had truly understood the danger of fighting America long term. Without him, the Navy drifted into desperate gambles and defensive battles it could not win. His prophecy, that Japan could run wild for 6 months before facing disaster, proved hauntingly true. For the United States, the mission was proof of what intelligence, industry, and daring could achieve. Codebreakers in hidden rooms, factory workers on assembly lines, and young pilots in twin-engine fighters had combined their efforts into a strike that shocked the world. It wasn't just about firepower, it was about brains, discipline, and the quiet strength of democracy mobilized for war. In the decades since, controversy lingered. Who fired the fatal burst, Lanphier or Barber? Historians debated, veterans argued, and the question was never fully resolved. But in truth, the answer mattered less than the mission itself. They had all shared the risk. They had all flown into the unknown. And together, they had changed the course of the Pacific War. Years later, when Rex Barber was asked how he felt about being the man who likely shot down Yamamoto, he paused. His answer was not boastful, not dramatic, but quiet. "I didn't think of it as killing a man. I thought of it as completing an assignment. But history decided it was more. Operation Vengeance was more. It was vengeance, yes, but also revelation. It revealed Japan's vulnerability. It revealed America's growing power. And it revealed the truth Yamamoto himself had known all along, that in the end, this war would be decided not by daring raids or brilliant admirals, but by the sheer weight of American industry and resolve. On April 18, 1943, in the skies over Bougainville, the man who had unleashed war on the United States fell from the heavens, and with him, a part of Japan's confidence fell too. The hunters returned to their base in silence, the wreckage burned in the jungle, and the Pacific kept its secrets. But history remembered. If you believe this story deserves to be remembered not just as a tale of vengeance, but as a moment that shaped the war, please like and subscribe. Together, we keep these memories alive.